Welcome back, Leicester Middle School Wildcats. So now we're going to look at part two of the Black Death, and we're going to talk about how the Black Death actually spread. So the spread of the Black Death. Well, the Black Death actually started out in as a disease that came out of Mongolia, and it traveled along the trade routes and it reached the Black Sea. This is the Black Sea in 1346, and the Mongols actually they were actually they were actually in the process of conquering all of Europe and Asia. And at this time, they stopped in this little area called Crimea, and they stopped at this town called uh, Kaffa, and they were looking to take over this town. And in order to conquer it, they brought the plague with them, and they knew how deadly the plague was. So they catapulted dead human bodies into the town, and that helped the town. That enabled the plague to spread throughout the town, and the town fell, and the Mongolians went and they conquered it, and that's one way the Black Plague actually reached uh, Europe. But from Kaffa, it actually spread throughout the rest of Europe and also to North Africa. So we're going to look at this map for a second, and then we're going to talk about the spread in villages versus cities. Okay, so if we look at this map, okay, I'm going to go down here and I'm going to read part C. It says a shipment of grain brought plague infected rats to Europe. Uh, to see how the plague spread, compare the trade routes from north from Italy on map A. You're going to have to go back to map A to actually do that, but we're just going to go through this right here. Okay, and we have a little map key right here. It says the spread of the bubonic plague, and you have different color rectangles, which symbolizes the years the plague actually reached certain areas in Europe. So if we look here at number two, it's this bright orange right here. And so in 1346, this plague actually reached Crimea, and the plague actually spread from there. And then if you look here, there's this a little bit less bright orange, okay, and that's 1347. And then if we look here, this is 1348, and it just continued to spread. Okay, so by the year 1350, the plague killed 35% of the people in London. London was a pretty heavily populated city. So now we're going to look at rural cities and villages versus rural communities. We're going to determine which one was hit harder. So we say that the rural communities were not hit as hard because cities were really hit hard because they had poor sanitation and it was heavily populated and people lived really close to each other. And some villages were so bad that they had to be abandoned. Like people just left the whole village and just left the village and left everything there. The poor suffered more than the rich. The rich actually had ways to actually take care of themselves. The rich could actually move whenever they wanted to. But this is really interesting right here. Doctors and priests were more likely to become ill and to die. So this is a picture of Venice. Venice was another crowded city. Yeah, it grew wealthy from trade. Remember that Venice was controlled trade on the Mediterranean Sea, and but with trade also brought the disease. So plague was worse, was really bad in Venice because it was overcrowded and poor sanitation, and the plague devastated the whole city of Venice. So we're going to look at the reactions and responses to the plague. So we're going to look at the religion, and then we're going to talk about the science. So religion, um, Christians during this time believed that the plague was a punishment from God for human wickedness. And in Germany, a group called the Flagellants um, rose up and they started to whip themselves to ask for God's forgiveness. And also, Christians persecuted or punished Jews because they believed that the Jews were responsible for the plague. And then with science, Europeans looked to astrology to explain the plague. And there was an article actually published by the University of Paris, which basically said that Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars were closely lying together, and that was the cause of the plague. They also created medicines that were not very effective, and they burned incense to clean the air. So all of this was ineffective, and it did not help decrease the spread of the plague. In art, artists actually drew, and during this time, artists became very fascinated with death, and you can see a lot of pictures of skeletons during this time, and the skeletons actually had like little bits of flesh hanging off the skin, off the bones. And this was basically symbolic for the experience that the people were having. If you can see, the skeletons are still dancing, they're still trying to be human, but you can see that they're dying because they're skeletons. So the death is actually represented in the skeletons, but they're trying to be human. They're still trying to enjoy themselves, which is really hard to do when there's a global pandemic. And so one thing that people did was they would spontaneously or just start dancing all of a sudden, and they would dance for hours and hours until they would drop from exhaustion. Okay, so now we're going to look at a nursery rhyme. Legend says that this nursery rhyme was created out of the Black Plague. Some people say it was, some people say it wasn't. We're going to look at this video and see what it says.
Well, that was a little creepy. I mean, how could such a seemingly innocent song, sung by children everywhere, be about something so dark and macabre? I mean, you do know Ring Around the Rosie is about the plague, right? Here, let me break it down for you. Ring Around the Rosie. The bubonic plague, or the Black Plague, would produce lumps on the affected people, with a distinctive red ring around the so-called rosy polyp. A pocket full of posies. Plague doctors, you know, the ones with the creepy-looking beak masks, were known to shower a diseased person with sweet-smelling flowers, posies, thinking that they would ward away the disease. Ashes, ashes. When someone died from the plague, their bodies were cremated and turned to, you guessed it, ashes. Which brings us finally to We All Fall Down. With over 50 million people dead from the Black Death, 1/3 of Europe's population did, in fact, fall down. So yeah, I'd say Ring Around the Rosie is pretty creepy. Okay, hold on. Yeah, none of that is true. What? What do you mean? Didn't you hear me explain it? It makes so much sense. Yeah, it might sound convincing, but let's look at the facts. For starters, this theory that Ring Around the Rosie is all about death and disease only dates back to the mid-20th century. The first written version of the rhyme only dates back to the 1850s, and it's pretty different than the one we know today. It doesn't even mention ashes or falling down. Okay, yeah, sure, but the plague did cause ring rashes, and plague doctors did use flowers to ward away the disease. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies. Come on, that's true, but look at it this way. If the song really does date back to the plague of London in 1665, then you would think that someone would have written it down before the 1800s. And if the version from the 1850s is as different from today's, imagine how different the version from 1665 would sound. It seems a little more likely that the rosies and posies were, well, just flowers. Okay, well, if you're so smart, what does it actually mean then, huh? Well, more likely than not, it doesn't mean anything. It's just a fun rhyme and song that kids have been singing for generations. Well, that's not very interesting. I thought this was a fun bit of folklore. Oh no, it is. In fact, it's folklore about folklore. It's meta folklore. I mean, what makes Ring Around the Rosie so interesting is not its real history, but this strange, mysterious history that's grown around it. People have been retelling and revising this plague story for decades, so much so that it has become folklore itself. See, one reason we love this plague story is because of what it seemingly reveals about the people and culture of the 1600s. But maybe even more interesting is looking at our own folklore, like this story of how Ring Around the Rosie is apparently about death and disease, and asking ourselves what it reveals about the people and culture of today. And that is pretty cool. All right, that is pretty cool. So what do you think Ring Around the Rosie is about? Let us know in the comments below. And be sure to like and subscribe before heading over to Sporcle.com for more mentally stimulating diversions.
So in our next video, in part 3, we're going to talk about the impact of the Black Plague. So be sure to check out that next video as well.